Okay, good morning, everybody. So, like I said, I was going to give you a quick mark scheme for this assignment that you were doing in class this week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to go through it quite quickly with you and just try to show you what was required here. So I'm going to go ahead over here on a REPL file, and I'm going to go ahead and drag this out really quick. Create a new file and call it employee.java. Make sure you name your E with a capital letter because the convention is to name classes with capital letters. So I'm going to go ahead and create this public class employee and go ahead and do that. And now we can do the first question. Well, the first question says, create an employee class with the following instance variables: employee ID. So what I like to do is just go ahead and type out all your instance variables. So we have name, we have surname, probably should put colons there or semicolons there and get this out of the way so we have a little bit more space. Go into this window a little bit more. There you go. So everything's a little bit larger. Name, surname, position, salary, count, tax, and employed on year, and that's it. Okay, let me just go ahead. Now, one of the things that you should realize here, and to get full marks for a question like this, even if you saw a question like this on the AP, is to go ahead and make sure you declare all your instance variables private, because the AP requires that you have all your instance variables declared as private. Although one thing to note is usually the AP questions won't be as open-ended as this, as in the sense that over here I'm letting you go ahead and create your own. I'm telling you just the name of the variable. I'm asking you to decide what the data type of each of these will be. On the AP, this won't necessarily be the case. They will probably suggest data types. But I like the idea of you having to decide some of these for your own. So I'm going to go ahead and go string, and I'll make this a string as well. And I'll make the position a string as well. I'll make the salary a double, or maybe an integer. Maybe I'll make it a double. I'll make count an integer. I'll make the amount you're going to get taxed as a double, and employed on year will be an integer. Just a quick note here for you really quickly, and that is that in the AP, the only data types that you need to be familiar with are string, double, and Boolean. So if you're ever confused on what you should call your data types, that you should just call them one of those three things. Okay? All right, so that being said, we can now go ahead and move on to the second question here, which has come up with at least 3 more relevant instance variables. Okay, and that shouldn't be too difficult. So for example, the 3 more relevant instance variable, I'm just going to quickly type here question 2. And this is just for me, and if you want to look at this later, you will be able to refer to this file better as well. So for question 2, I'm going to go ahead and create 3 more relevant instance variables, and because they are instance variables, we know they should be public. And I'll make a string to encompass gender. I'll make another one, make another string to talk about, I don't know, maybe certificate or qualification. And I'll make another string to go ahead and maybe store the employee's address. Okay, so that's pretty good now there. Now it says initialize all the instance variables in both a default constructor, no parameters, and an overloaded constructor, which takes parameters. So what I'm going to do, and this is just for the example, you should go ahead and initialize all of them. I'm only going to initialize the top 6 values, just because I want to save time here. Okay, so you understand that the default constructor should be a public constructor. It should have the same name as the class, so it's employee, and the default constructor takes no parameters, so you leave it inside closed brackets, and that's it. Right? So in the default constructor, I obviously have to initialize employee ID, and I'm going to leave that there just for a second. I'll come back and do that later. and I'm going to have to initialize name. I have to leave that, but I'll do that later as well. Surname, position, salary, and I'm just leaving these all blank for now. Count and tax. Count, tax, and employed on year. There you go. All right, so I'll leave that like that, and I'm going to leave this blank for now. So you can see that I haven't really initialized anything, but I will be doing so in just a second. So I'm going to copy all of this and go ahead and make a overloaded constructor. And in this case, what I can do is now over here I can take parameters. So for example, I'm looking for string employee ID, and I'm looking for string name. Give me 1 second. Let me go ahead and make this larger. Okay, and I'll come back to that in just a sec. And I'll go ahead and go string surname, and I'll go ahead and go string position. And I think my salary was a double. And then I'll go ahead and go, so count is something that I don't need to take an instance for. I'll talk to you about that more in a second. I'm going to go double and tax. Actually, that's something that I don't need to take a parameter for either. And I'll go double employed on year. Employed on YEAR. Okay, that looks good. Just give it 1 sec. Just go ahead and zoom out a little bit. Sorry, computer's being a bit weird. Okay, all right, there you go. So that looks good for now. So now what I need to do to initialize these, and there needs to be a little bit of you need to do a little bit of, kind of work here. But the first thing I want you to do before you move on at this point is realize that these two constructors are very, very similar, and that's something that we will, kind of come to at like slightly later. So what I want to do here is I want to refer to the instance variable, this.employee. So now at this point, the employee ID on line 29 is referring to the employee ID that you have set up here on line 3. Because I use the keyword this, so the keyword this always refers to the instance variable, and I can make it equal to employee ID, and this is the parameter. Okay, this parameter here. So this dot employee ID refers to the instance variable, and employee ID here refers to the formal parameter that's declared on line 28. Okay, and then what you're going to do is you're going to do exactly the same thing for all of the rest of these values. So you can do this kind of mindlessly if you want to. And what I can do is I can go ahead and copy this, and I can just paste it for surname. Oop. I can just paste it for surname. So Command V here. I can paste it for position. Command V here. I can paste it for salary. I'm going to leave count out just for a second. I'll show you why in a sec. And I'll paste it for employed on year. Okay, and I'm going to take the count away from here really quick, and I'll put it at the top. And all of this will make sense in a second. All right, I'm not doing anything with count just yet. And let me go ahead and initialize these instance values to the parameter. So name is equal to surname, and position is equal to position, and salary is equal to salary. I'm sorry, I forgot the equals here. And we'll say tax is equal to tax. And employed on year is equal to employed on year. Okay, very good. So that's our overloaded constructor done. And I'm just going to write a comment over here, just saying this is question 3, or this was question 3. All right, now let's go back and oops. Let me go back. Let me go ahead and make this a bit smaller. Okay, and go back over here. So question 4 says write an implementation on how to generate an employee ID. Hint, use the count. The ID must be unique for each object. Okay, I'm going to skip number 4 for a second. I'll come back to it. And it says rewrite the default constructor using the this keyword. Number 6 says replace all ambiguity in the constructor using the this keyword. So you can see that I've used the this keyword and replaced all ambiguity here. So that's that part done. And it says write an implementation for the toString method. Use this keyword in your constructor such that it prints the default object each time a new object is created, and test your code in the main class. Okay, so the first thing that I kind of want to clarify to you is the count variable. Now this variable is supposed to be a static variable, okay, and we are going to initialize this variable to equal 0 at the very beginning. And the reason we do that is because the count is supposed to keep track of how many employee objects or instances of the employee object has been creating using this class as a template, right? So every time you create an object in your main class, you will see that one of these constructors will be called, either the default constructor or the overloaded constructor. So what I can do is I can say, well, every time an object is called using one of these constructor, I can plus count. I can increment 1 to count, and that is going to help me go ahead and create an implementation for this count value, right? So now let's go back to question 4 where it says write an implementation on how to generate an employee ID. And one of the things you can do is use count, and it's using count is a good way to write an implementation for employee ID. The reason it's a good way to write an implementation for employee ID is because count will always be unique. So if you were the first employee, when you were created, your count is going to be 1. When you're the second employee, when you were created, your count is going to be 2. So if you're using that value to create an employee ID will always somehow be unique, regardless of whether or not you work for the same position and for the same, let's say you have the same name, let's say you were employed in the same year, but that way count will always be unique. Now you could create a separate method for this, for employee ID, but I'm not going to, right? I'm going to do something very simple for count, and all I'm going to do is say employee ID is maybe equal to, let's say the first letter of your, actually, I'm just going to say it's equal to count, all right? And that would be sufficient. Now you could do something more sophisticated, and we will talk about different solutions about this in class, all right? But this will be sufficient in terms of creating an employee ID. Now, notice that I haven't really given any default variables in my default constructor. I haven't set up any default values here, okay? And that's something that I'm going to have to do, all right? So I will do that in just a sec, but let's just go ahead and look at what the questions are asking us to do. So now it says, if you look at question 5, it says rewrite the default constructor using the this keyword. Now remember, if I typed the this keyword over here with brackets, this line right here is actually calling my overloaded constructor over here, okay? That's what it's essentially doing. It's calling the overloaded constructor. Now what I have to do is I would look at the method signature here. It's taking a string, 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 double, double, and it's calling this. And that's what I can do. Instead of rewriting this code twice, I can just call that over here. So let's say my default employee ID is always just going to be count. That's an implementation. That's something that I don't have to pass. So this is something I don't have to worry about. I can get rid of employee ID. Let's say my default name is going to be something very simple, like for example, employee ID, okay, or maybe the word employee plus employee ID. Okay, now that's a concatenation between a double and a string, but understand that that will be a string. Now what that does when you do something like that is basically what it does is it says, well, you know what, it's going to set this word string and then the employee ID is the count, right? So if you were the first employee created, then your employee ID in this case would be employee 1. If you were the second employee created, your employee in this case would be employee 2, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you could do something like this, or if you wanted, you could say something like even simpler, like count. All right, so that's going to be your name, and your surname by default I'm just going to leave blank. Your position by default I'm going to leave as something like associate, and you can decide what you want here. Your salary here by default I'm going to say is, let's say, 10,000. All right. Now remember, salary is a double, so we should actually put it in as a double. And I have quotations around there for no reason. Again, we've already talked about the implementation of count. We've already done that, so we don't need to worry about that. I'm not going to do the implementation for tax. I'll talk to you about that in just a second. So I'll get rid of that. Let me just, and employed on year. Now you would use the date here, but I'm just going to set this to 2022. Okay, I'm just going to set this to this year's date. Now notice that what I'm actually passing here is employee ID plus count, and then nothing, and then associate, and then 10,000.0, and then 2022. If you look at this, string, 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 double, and then double, all right? And that's the same as the method signature here. So string, 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 right? String, and then double, and then double. So instead of calling all these lines separately, what we can do quite simply is call it all in this method. So I can say over here is the first parameter I'm going to pass is employee plus count. And then I'll write it, sorry, I wrote count. And then the second parameter I'm going to pass is I'm going to write, just need to separate it by a comma, is going to be just empty string. And then the third parameter I'm going to pass is associate. And then the fourth parameter I'm going to pass, so I just passed employee ID, name, surname, and position, right? Employee ID, employee name, and then, so I don't need to pass one for employee ID here. I'm just going to get rid of that because I'm setting the ID inside this variable already, right? So employee plus count, and then associate. That's my position. And then what I need to do is pass the salary. So the salary will be 10,000.0. So I'll pass that over here as well. And I need to pass the employed on year, which is 2022. Okay? So as long as I do all that, then I don't need to worry about anything over here. I can just delete all of that. Okay? And then what I can do is I can look at this over here and I can say, all right, well, this is taking care of most of it. I can make this actually even simpler. I don't even need to pass pass the employee plus count, you know, but I will leave that there, but maybe I won't do the count here. Because what I'll do is I'll implement it over here, right? I'll implement, for example, the employee ID will be name plus count. Okay? Which is very similar to what I had before over here. I just did it over here. And then the name will just be, you know, the same. It'll just be, sorry, my bad. So employee ID here will just be count, and the employee name by default will be name plus count. All right, by default. And then your surname is just going to be surname, your position is going to be associate, your salary is going to be 10,000. And I haven't implemented tax yet, okay, but we will do this. Let me get rid of that. Tax and employed on year is employed on year. Okay, so let me go ahead and replace this on this line because that makes a little bit more sense. And we haven't done an implementation for tax yet, and I will be doing that in just a second. So this is how you would have your class set up. And notice how many lines of code I've gotten rid of just by using the this and calling the secondary constructor, right? So the count plus plus will still be called, even though you haven't called it here, because remember, understand what this is doing is this line of code on line 19 is calling this entire constructor, which starts on line 22. Okay, so count plus plus will be called right there, right? So I did a pretty simple implementation there. You could have done something far more aggressive. But you know, it is satisfying the requirements here. So number 5, I've rewritten the default constructor here. So I'll put this in as question 5. Okay, and write an implementation to generate employee ID. I've done that here. So I'll put this in as question 4. I'm just writing some comments for you so you can see what I've done. Replace all ambiguity using the this keyword. So I'll write this dot, okay? So this is obviously, I've figured out question 6 here as well. Okay, it's a little bit messy, but that's okay. Like, this is what the question's asking. You're seeing a class come to life, so, you know, it'll be a little bit confusing. And then it says write at least 3 accessors and mutators for 3 of your variables. So this is question 7. And I'm not going to write 3 accessors and mutators because it will follow the exact same structure as each other. So I'll just write 1. So I'll write an accessor and mutator for maybe the name value, okay? So I'll write an accessor and mutator for the employee name. So let's go ahead and write the accessor first. And the accessor will obviously return a string for name. So public string, and the accessor usually takes it usually uses the phrase get name. Okay, the get is usually a default kind of name for accessor methods. And what I can just say here, and very simple, is I can say return name. Now, if you want it to be very clear in your mind that you're referring to the instance variable, you could type this.name in if you'd like. You don't have to. You could just leave it as return name. And then I'll go ahead and type in a mutator here. And my mutator would return nothing here. And the mutator usually takes the form of set name, but this one actually has to take a parameter, string name. So you're changing the name to something, which is very possible, right? Your employee might be able to change their name. This is a very common thing in Thailand. In Thailand, people change their names all the time. So they wanted to, use the same object instance, but you want to change their name. So this one would obviously return nothing, but this one will say name equals name. Now this is confusing, but this name refers to the formal parameter name up here, and this name refers to the instance variable, and you would write this.name to make sure that there's no confusion there. And it doesn't return anything. But if you would like, and this is good practice, I think, at least for you testing your code, is you can write a system.out.println line, and you can say something like name change successful. And we'll talk more about how to do this in a better way by using try-catch blocks moving on from here. And what I am going to do is I am going to move the commenting of the accessor and mutator to just like over here, so it looks a little bit cleaner. You have a little bit more space. And there's no reason you'd need to do that either. Okay? All right? So you would have to do 3 of these, and I'm only doing 1 for you. But, it is what it is. So we finished question 7 there. And now it says question 8. It says write an implementation for the toString method. So let's go ahead and type out question 8. And the toString method, like I explained earlier, is available to all Java objects, ones you create or ones you reuse. The idea of the toString method is that by default, it gives you the type of the object, and it tells you where in the memory that object is stored, that object reference is stored. But if you rewrite it, you can make it more valuable. You can talk more about the employee and what that specific object represents. So we're going to go ahead and go public string toString. This is a method signature that you cannot change, and a method header you cannot change. You should stick to this exact method. And this method returns a string. And you can determine here what makes up important information for this object type. For me, I'm just going to keep it very simple, and I'm just going to say name, which is name. And I'm just going to concatenate it with, remember, \n is an escape sequence for a string new line. And then I'll say something like position, and I'll add it to position. And I'll do maybe one more. And I'll maybe do salary. Okay. Now you might say, oh, that's a double, and here we're doing a string, but that's fine. We're concatenating, right? So that's taken care of right there. Okay, so that's question 8. That's done. You could add a lot more details here. I'm just not going to, but you could. Okay, you could add a lot more detail here, and you determine what your idea of useful information is. Question 9 says use this keyword in your constructor such that it prints the object's details each time a new object is created. So you basically, to print the object details each time a new object is created, you basically want to call this toString method. And to do that, quite simply, all you have to do here is just go system.out.println and just type in this. And when you type in this inside the constructor, or when you write system.out.println and you put this inside the parameters, what it does is it will call the toString method as long as you have an implementation for that. And notice I don't need to put it in my default constructor. Why? Because my default constructor is calling my overloaded constructor, and that implementation is already inside my overloaded constructor, and that's sufficient, right? So this line of code is actually calling these lines of code, and these lines of code's already printing this, and that's sufficient. And this is your solution to question 9. Okay? All right, let me go ahead and tab this out a little bit so you can see that a little bit better. Okay? All right, so that's that done. Now it says test your code in the main class by initializing at least 3 objects instances of type employee. Ensure at least one of them is, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this from the left to the right. Okay, ensure at least one of them is initialized using the default constructor and one using the overloaded constructor. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So to do this, we're going to have to go ahead and switch to the main class, and that's what I've done over here. And in the main class, I have to initialize an employee using the default constructor, which is very easy because all I do is employee, and you can call this anything you want. I'm going to call this E1, and I'm going to make it equal to new employee. Okay, and if I leave the brackets empty there, then that will be initialized using the default constructor. Now I'm going to go ahead and create another employee, and I'm going to call this E2, and I'm going to make it equal to new employee and I'm going to create another one, and this one will be called E3, but this one will actually give it parameters. Okay, we'll give this one parameters. Now the best way to do this, I feel, is you should refer back to your constructor and your default constructor, and you should see what it's asking for. Right? So this constructor is taking specific parameters, and it's useful to go back here, okay? And it's useful to have that information right here so you can see what that constructor is asking for. Oops, sorry. Let me go back there. I guess I missed that. Let me take this, Command C, go here, Command V, okay. And let me go ahead and, so the constructor is asking for a name, a surname, a position, a salary, and an employed on year. So if I was inputting an employee, in this case, maybe the name I'd give it is Bob, maybe the surname I'd give it is, this guy is going to have 2 first names because I'm lazy to think of a better one. The position I'm going to give him is senior manager. And then the double salary I'm going to give him is I'm going to give him 100,000 baht a month, 100,000.0, and then he's going to be employed on year 2022. Okay, and that's it. And there, I've tested my code. Now, if I ran this program, and I will run it for you at the end, you would see that employee 1, we can actually guess. E1, object instance E1 would have the name employee 1, object instance E2 would have the name employee 2, object instance E3 would have the name Bob Tom. He's a senior manager, he makes 100,000 a month, and he was employed on 2022, and his employee ID would be employee 3, all right? Because the count variable would be incremented each time an object is created, and you would see their, you would see all their information because you're printing the toString method every time the object is created because of this line of code right here in line 33, right? And line 33 obviously calls the toString method here. So that's it. You don't need to test it in any other way. That's sufficient. So that's question 10 and 11 done there. Sorry, they were supposed to be a part of 1. I kind of messed it up. But yeah, I'll just go ahead and write 10 and 11. So you understand that a little bit better. Now it says create an increase salary int method, and this one will increase salary by a specific value, 10,000, and then you have a create increase salary double method, and this will increase salary by a percentage value. Both of these need specific conditions, right? So the increase salary int method cannot take an integer which is larger than 10,000 Thai baht, and then the increase salary double method cannot take a double which is more than 20%. Okay, so both of these methods, these are an example of overloaded methods. They have it's the same method name, but they have different method signatures, right? One takes an integer, the other takes a double value. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our employee class, and then we're going to go here and go ahead and say, all right, well, this is our question 12. All right, so let's go ahead and do it. So we don't need to return anything here. Actually, it says print a message on the console letting the user know the salary status, whether it was changed or not. And we can just print that in our conditions, right? So public void, and we're going to go ahead and call it increase salary, and this one is going to take an integer, okay? And you're increasing salary by some number, so I guess we'll call this increment. Okay, makes sense, I think. And I'll go ahead and I'll make the second method as well. And this one will take a double as an increment. All right, and this one I'll just go ahead and write out question 13 over here as well. So this increment, we have to check whether or not that increment is greater than 10,000. So I'm going to go ahead and write a quick conditional here and say if increment is less than or equal to 10,000, then we're going to say salary plus equals increment. Else, nothing. All right, now, so normally we wouldn't need to put the else in there, but the reason I'm putting the else in there is because the question over here actually states, it says print a message letting the user know whether the salary was changed, right? So system.out.println, and inside this println, I'm going to go ahead and say salary changed to, or salary successfully changed. And then you can print the value of salary so they know their new salary, okay? And in this else, what I'm going to do is say salary not changed. All right, easy peasy, that's it, right? That's it. And for this double method, you do pretty much exactly the same thing. So why don't I just go ahead and copy this condition right here? And over here you have a little bit of choice, like how you're going to take this value of increment. But in this case, I'm just going to take it as a decimal place. So I'm going to say if it's less than or equal to 0.2, which is a 20% increase, then we will say salary plus equals, actually, yeah, we have to say salary plus equals salary multiplied by increment. If you did it like this, 0.2, if you did it 20, if you put 20 here, then that would be a different story, right? And then you can say the same thing, and then else the same thing, all right? That's pretty much your implementation there. I've literally changed one line of code, so this is just something you need to think about a little bit, right? So I'm taking this input over here, this increment, I'm taking it as a decimal percentage value instead of a whole number, which is I think it's fine the way it is. All right. And you could have done it as 20 instead as well, and that would have been fine as well. But this line of your implementation would be slightly different, but it should be fairly simple. Now it says, number 15 says, type out the method signatures of all the methods in this class as comments immediately above each method. Now I'm not going to do them for all of them, but I will do it for a few just to kind of show you. So this one, for example, will be called increase salary and double. Right? That's it. Right? And I'll comment it. The method signature here is exactly the same. So the method name, increase salary, and this one would be an integer. All right? Okay? I'm not going to do it for the rest, but you know, it's the same idea. So method signature, all it is a method signature is the name of the method, and then the parameters, the data type of the parameters that it receives, you know, separated by comma. So you can see over here again, even though the method increase salary on line 64 and the method increase salary on line 53 have the exact same name, the data type they receive, of the parameters they receive, are different, and that's what constitutes the method signature. I'm not going to do them for all of them, but you can. And then the last one says, write a method called calcTax, implement that method, blah, blah, blah. And then the last one says, in the main class, ASCII text draw chart. So I'll do number 17 in class with you, but I'll do number 16 right now. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and write an implementation for calculating tax. So I'm going to call it public void calcTax. All right, and it's going to take nothing as a parameter. You could make it take something as a parameter, but in this case, I'm not going to take anything as a parameter, and I will comment this as question 16. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is, now realistically what you'd like to do is you'd look up, you'd like to have like a range of salary scales and things like that and so on and so forth, but I'm going to do a very simple implementation of this, right? So basically there's a couple of tax brackets, and that determines how much you're going to be taxed on an annual basis. For me, I'm going to make them up as I go instead of doing some research. I hope you did your research, but I think this is basically correct. So anyone in Thailand who's making under 300,000 baht a year, yearly tax, okay? I'll write them out in comments for you. So anyone who's making under 300,000, okay, yearly, sorry, I apparently, no, yeah, that's correct. Anyone who's making 300,000, their tax is 0%, okay? And then anyone who's making between 300 and 750,000, their tax is going to be, actually, I'm going to tab this out. Their tax is going to be, I believe this is the 10% bracket. And then anyone who's making, so less than $1 million, so 700 to $1 million, they're taxed at 15%. And, you know, now there's a lot more brackets here, but I'm getting lazy, so I'm just going to go ahead and type anything above 1 million. So 1 million and above. Let's just say greater than or equal to 1 million is 20%. Okay, well that is obviously not true, but we'll just stick to it just so you can see how this method kind of works. And let me tab those out so it looks a little bit nicer. And then all you realistically have to do here is just implement, you know, a sequence of conditionals to kind of do this. So I'm going to go ahead and write if, and it's going to basically take the user salary, so you'd have to multiply it by 12, right? Because we've implemented the salary here as a monthly salary, but when we're looking at tax, we have to look at it yearly. And we have to say if salary multiplied by 12 is less than 300,000, is that correct? Yeah, is less than 300,000, then what we can say is tax is equal to 0.0. All right, and do we just continue on, right? So else if 750,000, if it's less than 750,000, then we're basically going to say your tax is equal to, and I'll take this as a percentage, right? 0.1, right? That's 10%, right? That's the same as 10%. And I can just copy this instead of rewriting it again and again and again. I can just copy it and say else if salary multiplied by 12 is less than. Okay, so if salary is less than 1 million, then it's 0.15, and then the last one will just be an else, and I'll say tax is equal to 0.2, and that's it. Okay, we finished it. There you go. All right, that's dunsies. Over here you can see you're multiplying salary by 12 a bunch of times. Oopsies, sorry about that. You're multiplying salary by 12 a bunch of times. So what you might decide to do here is create a local parameter and call it something like annual salary and make it equal to salary multiplied by 12. And then instead of doing this calculation for each separate thing, you could just now use annual salary. I spelled annual incorrectly. That's fine. I'm sorry. It doesn't really matter. Okay, because you're doing this calculation multiple times. Now, just want to make a quick note here. Annual salary the scope of annual salary resides inside this method and only inside this method. So what that means is it's created and destroyed inside this method, and that's it. Okay, now the last thing I have to do, and the questions don't specifically specify this, but hopefully you have connected the dots, is I do need to come back up here, and I do need to go ahead and say, well, I have a tax value here that I actually haven't initialized. Okay, so I've given the employee an annual salary or a monthly salary, but I haven't initialized a tax value, as you can see here on line 32. So what I need to do is I need to find a way to use this method that I have here, okay, to initialize this value that I have here. Okay, so I need to initialize this value that I have here. So all I really need to do is, since this method, right, and this is there's many different ways to do this, and I'm just showing you one way to do it. This method is actually setting the instance variable tax. So all I really need to do is I just need to call calc tax somewhere in my constructor, and that will initialize the value of my tax. Okay, so instead of writing this dot tax over here, all I need to do is call that method calc tax, and that's it. Okay, and this will initialize my tax value. Okay, there you go, done. All right, so that's pretty much it. I will make sure that this file is shared with you, just so you understand this method. I could have, instead of just, setting up the tax value, I could have returned the tax value, and then I could have, set up the variable here, right? I could have done that as well, but, I think this way it's quite simple to understand and do. So in the last question, it says draw UML table, and I'll do the UML table with you in class. I know it's quite difficult to draw here, but I will put an example of the UML table up as well. But that should have been fairly simple. That shouldn't have been one of the focuses of here. Okay, well, if you have any questions, make sure you write them down, and I'll be sure to discuss them with you when I see you in class. Have a lovely day. I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.